Hi everyone. It's been a long time since we did a video, so today we're gonna learn how to do NPCs that follow a spline path, and we're gonna do it what I think is the correct way. So the first thing you'll need is your character. I just created a child blueprint of the character. I called it tutorial NPC, so this is gonna be our NPC AI, and I'm just gonna open that up here. And you can see that this is just a default mannequin. It's got some other stuff in here because this is a character I'm working on for a game, but you can just use the default mannequin and it'll work just the same. So the next thing that we're going to need is our AI controller. So that's going to be essentially what determines the actions that this NPC will take. So we want to go to right click here in this folder. We're going to add a blueprint class, and we're going to search for AI controller, and you can call that whatever you want. I'm going to call it tutorial NPC underscore AI. So let's set up the NPC first. So the NPC needs a couple of things. The first thing that it needs is a spline component, and so we're going to add that here. So we're just going to go add and search for spline component. Spline, it's under here, utility spline, and we're going to call that movement path. And you can see here that it adds the spline to this character, and this, we'll be able to click and drag around on instances of this NPC when we drag and drop them into the world. Now there are a couple of other things that I like to do here to get set up. So firstly, in the construction script, I'm just going to drag out a reference to this movement path, and we're going to change a couple of things here. So the first thing is we're also going to add a branch node, and we're going to create a variable here called path is closed loop. That's a bit of a long name, but it's fine. And we're going to click on this and make it instance editable and expose on spawn. And then we're going to plug this into the branch, and then we're going to drag off from this movement path reference, and we're going to say set closed loop, leave this unchecked so that this will be false, and then we can hook these up. Sorry, let's do it like this. So path is closed loop, default value of false. So if it's false, then we'll do nothing, but if it's true, then we will turn the path into a closed loop. And this is, if I can just show you here what this does. So this character now has a spline. If we drag out this spline, this is going to be the path that this character follows. But you can see it's just a straight path, and sometimes you're going to want this path to be a closed loop. So that path is closed loop that we exposed here. If we tick that, it's just going to close this loop. So now you can see that this is no longer just a straight line, it's actually a closed loop, and so that can be useful. So that's it for the construction script. There's a couple of other things that we need to do now in the event graph. So the first thing is on event begin play, we want to make a variable here, and we're going to call it walk speed, and we're going to make this a float and make it instance editable and expose on spawn. And we'll drag in this walk speed, and then from our character movement component, let's drag that in, set what's it called here, set max walk speed, and we'll use our walk speed to plug in this value here. So we'll hook this up, and this is just giving us a let's compile and save and give this a default value of, say, 300. And what this is going to do is just allow you to control the walk speed of the NPC. Now there's one more thing that we need to do to set up the character before we can look at the controller AI, and that is, you can see here we have this NPC here, and he's got his movement path that he'll follow, but there's a problem. So if he starts walking to follow that movement path, you'll notice the movement path is going with him, and that's because this is a component that's attached to the actor, and that's what we don't want. That we don't want the component to follow him around, because then it's going to mess up his movement path. The way we're going to resolve this here is in our blueprint. We're going to grab our movement path reference. So this is our spline, and we're going to detach that from our character when the game starts. So as soon as the game starts, the character is gonna drop that spline path where it is, and it's not gonna move. And for the location rules here, we just want to make sure that we're setting it to keep its world location. So we want it to keep its world's location, rotation, and scale, so that this will stay in its same world position essentially and at the same size. So that's it for the character. Now let's work on the AI. So here's our tutorial AI. There's currently nothing in here. And we're gonna need a couple of things. We're gonna need some functions here. So off of this begin play, just hold down S and click to add a sequence node. And we're going to add, let's see, two more pins here, and we can get rid of this event tick. We don't want to call that. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get a reference to that movement path on the pawn that is owned by this, or that is controlled by this AI. So let's do that first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get controlled pawn. So this is saying what pawn is this controller controlling. So this is the AI controller. We will set it to control a specific AI pawn in the world. Which one is it controlling? And then we're going to cast that to our tutorial NPC. And let's execute this. And this is going to say, is this a tutorial NPC, yes or no? And if it succeeds, then we want to grab this reference and store it. So we're going to promote this to a variable, and we're going to call it, what are we going to call this? Tutorial NPC reference. So this is a reference to our NPC character. The next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to get the movement path. So get movement path. So this is getting the movement path of this character reference. So we're getting a reference to the pawn. That's our, the character that this is controlling, and then we're getting the movement path of that, and that's that spline that we created. So we're getting the spline, and we want to store that spline as a reference as well. So we're going to promote this to a variable, and we're going to call it movement. Let's call that movement path reference. I'm just going to name it something different, so that it's evident that these two are distinct. All right, so we're going to right-click all of this, right-click and collapse to function, and we're going to call this get references, because that's what this function is doing. It's getting the references to our pawn that's controlled by this AI controller, and it's getting the references to that spline path that we created. And inside of this function, so just double click to open this up, we want to add one more thing here, which is a return node. And we will plug this output up here and return two things. First, our movement path reference. This is our movement path reference, and then we also want to return the reference to our NPC character, so that we don't have to do this cast again. We'll call this tutorial NPC reference. So we can compile and save this, and add some rewrote nodes to just clean this up. And there we go. So that is our first function, which gets all the references that we need. Next thing that we need is how long it's going to take this AI character to walk along the spline path. And so you're going to be creating a spline path by dragging around the splines, and that's going to change the length of the spline. And depending on the walk speed of the character, that'll change how long it takes for them to walk along that entire path. So we need to get that. So we're going to do a couple of things here. So we have these references right? We've got the references to our movement path, so let's get that, and let's get a reference to our tutorial NPC. And from the NPC, we want we want to drag off of that and get character movement. And from that, we want to get the walk speed. So get max walk speed. So now we have how fast our character is moving. And from the spline path, what we want to get is its length, because we need to know how long that spline path is. So we're going to go get spline length. And so we have the spline length, we have the walk speed, and what we need in order to get the duration of that is just sort of a division of these two things. So these are both going to return, this is going to return a walk speed in Unreal units. So this will be 300, and then by default, and then the spline length is going to return also a length of the spline in centimeters. So if we do a divide here, so we'll divide the length of the spline by how fast you can walk. That will tell you how much time it will take in order for you to walk around the whole thing. So we're going to promote this to a variable, this output, and we're going to call it spline walk duration. And then we're going to highlight this whole thing, right click and collapse this to a function. And we're going to call this get walk duration. So this is how long it's going to take for us to walk this whole spline path. So we'll hook this up here and then double click to go into this function. And we also want to add a return node here, just in case we need some of these things later. So we'll output this walk duration. So we'll call this output walk duration. Let's call it spline walk duration, since that is directly what it's outputting. Perfect. So the next thing that we do is we need to determine a play rate for a timeline. And this is going to sound, maybe this will be a little bit difficult to explain, but hopefully it will make sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this spline walk duration here, and we're going to get the inverse of this. So we're going to do a 1 divided by the spline walk duration. Before we do that, we actually need to add one more thing, which is a timeline. So we're just going to add a timeline, and we're going to call this whatever, NPC movement timeline. And we're going to set the play rate of this NPC movement timeline. So set, there we go, timeline components, set play rate. So these things here, this set play rate and this, we're just gonna, or not this, sorry, just the timeline, we're gonna move over here for a minute. We'll come back to that. But this play rate here, this spline walk duration, in the inverse of that is going to go in here, and then this is going to be our set play rate function. So we'll right click this and collapse to function, and we'll call this set play rate. And if we open this, we'll just add a return node here in case we need to add anything later on, and drop these down here like this so it's a little bit cleaner. And let's set up the timeline, and then I'll come back and explain what the set play rate node does. So we'll hook that up here, and then in our timeline, we're just going to double click to open this. We're going to make a new track, and we're going to call this ERP alpha, change the length to 1. We're going to use last keyframe and make it loop, and then we're going to add 2 keyframes. So the first one is going to be 0 and 0, so a time of 0 and a value of 0, and then we're going to add another keyframe, the time of 1, and a value of 1. All right, so then we will grab off of our then 3 here from the sequence node and hook it up to to this movement timeline. So this movement timeline has a duration of 1 second, and it is sort of lerping between values of 0 and 1. So it goes from 0, 0 to 1, 1. And what this set play rate node is doing is it's getting the inverse of this spline walk duration and using that as a value for setting the play speed of that timeline. The reason we're using divide here is because we actually want that to play slower, not faster. So if the path takes 10 seconds to walk around the whole perimeter, we want this timeline that has a length of 1 second to play 10 times slower. And so we'll divide that 1 second by that walk duration, and that will give us it's sort of a 10 times slower play rate, which will equate to 10 seconds in length. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, but that is how this will allow this to update so that the timeline is lerping from, or this lerp alpha, as this timeline updates, is going from 0 to 1 over the entire duration of however long it takes to walk around the spline path. So let's promote this lerp alpha to a parameter. We'll just call it lerp alpha, and we'll update it. So every time this updates, it's going to update this lerp alpha value. And then off of this, we're going to do a move to location. And there's one more thing that we need here, and that is we need to know where we want the character to move to. And where do we want the character to move to? Well, it depends how far along the spline they are. So we want them to follow the spline path. And for that, we need to get their distance along the spline. So we're going to get a reference to our movement path, and then we're going to get its length. So this will be the total length of our spline, and then we want to lerp this value between 0 and its total length, and that lerp is going to be, or that lerp alpha is going to be the lerp alpha from our timeline. And so this is going to allow this to get our current location along the spline, and it's going to update as this timeline updates. So from this movement path reference, we're going to do a get location at distance along spline. There we go. And we're going to return this lerp value into the distance. So this is getting the distance along our spline, and then we're using that to get the location along our spline. And then one other thing that we need to change here is we want these coordinates in world coordinates, because we want to know the location in the world where we want the character to go to, not local coordinate. All right, so now we can take this vector, this 3 vector, and plug it into our destination. If we compile and save, this should be fine. We shouldn't get any errors here. And then we're going to go ahead and highlight this and right-click and collapse this to a macro. And we'll call that macro, where are we going to get distance along spline. So we'll drag that macro here and compile and save. And this is everything that we need set up on our AI controller. So we have nice, clean AI code here. And there's one other thing that we need to do that I forgot to do at the start, which is in our NPC, our tutorial NPC character here, we need to go to AI controller and change its AI controller class default to our tutorial AI. And this is just going to tell this character, this NPC character, to use this AI controller instead of the default one. Now there are 2 more things that we need to do in order to get this working. So the first thing is we need to go into this, because I forgot to set this earlier. In the tutorial NPC, so in your NPC character blueprint, you need to go down here to under pawn where it says auto possess AI, change this to placed in world or spawn. This will work for this character because we placed him in the world, but if you wanted to spawn AIs at any point and you don't have that set, then they're not gonna move because they're not going to adopt the AI control. The other thing that we need in order for this to work is we need a navigation mesh, because AI obviously can't move if they don't have any navigation data about the world. So we're going to go here to select mode, sorry, not select mode, to the place actors panel, and we're going to search for what is it called? Navmesh bounds volume. And we're going to drag that into the world and close this. And then with this selected, you're going to scroll down to the brush settings and just increase the size of this to however large you need it to be. And if you hit P on your keyboard, it will show you the navigable areas that are being generated. So if I make this a bit larger, it's going to draw this out. Let's make it a little bit larger in Z. There we go. So this is encompassing my whole little test area. And now if I hit play, you can see that our NPC character is walking along that spline path. And if you select that character, you can grab these spline points and move them around. And as long as they are within the bounds of the nav mesh, this NPC character will walk along that spline path. And let's say, for example, you wanted an NPC character to run along the spline path. If I change this to a walk speed of 600, you can see now he's going to run along that path. So that's it for now. Don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe if you want to see more of this type of content. And if you don't, then don't. And that's it for now. So until next time.